Welcome to This Week's Okay at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague, Russell Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about informal contracts. So on a previous episode, and we like to reference this one just because it's fun, is we talked a little bit about contracts, being accepted through emojis and like different kind of contract practices in modern times. Similar to that, a lot of folks, because contracts are often in writing, are under the misconception or the notion that things have to be in writing and really formal and signed to be enforceable, which is true in some types of contracts like real estate contracts, but not really true in others. Verbal contracts can be enforceable, and you got to have offer, acceptance, consideration, like the things they teach you in law school, like right in the beginning, first semester. But what are some things that people need to consider when thinking about informal contracts, Russell?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main point is that with limited exception, you can have an oral contract. You can have, a not formally documented contract. As you said, all you need is offer, acceptance, consideration. You have a contract. There is something in the law called the statute of frauds, which we don't spend a lot of time getting into. But as my contracts professor in law school said, is neither a statute nor has anything to do with fraud. But it's the rule by which it sets forth the types of contracts that have to be in writing. Is relatively limited. So there's a lot of opening for contracts to be formed. Obviously, if you form them orally, there can be a great deal of ambiguity around the terms. And when it's simple, I'll paint your house for $500. That's a lot easier contract to understand and commit to orally than, a contract with a lot of moving parts. And if this happens, then that, those are much harder to iron out in an oral agreement. But you can have a contract whether or not it's written down in a lot of circumstances. So, as business owners and executives, that's something to be really conscious of, because you don't want to accidentally back your way into some sort of binding agreement. And frankly, we see it probably at a high risk with respect to employees, where hey, come work here for a year, and I'll give you this a $10,000 bonus. And the employee, when the employee gets fired after 6 months, says, no, you promised me 12 months of employment and a bonus. And the law is, in that circumstances, as we've said a million times here, is not favorable to employers. And even though the employee might have been hired as an at-will employee, you could create a contract for a term of employment that can bind the employer. So that's just one area where you have to be real careful about it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, leads to also some thoughts around emails, for example, right? So if you send someone an email, we'll use the paint my house example, like, hey, paint my house for $500. And then they say, okay, I'll be there at noon on Tuesday. It's like, well, I mean, that email in itself, right? I mean, is great evidence of that contract. So very informal. And there's reasons for things not to be informal, as you alluded to, because you really want to know what the terms are, what you're contracting around, make sure both parties are clear on what the terms are. That's the whole reason that we get involved in contracting, and sometimes they can get so lengthy and with all this language, is that we really want to make sure people are protected and that everyone's got a clear understanding of what's going to happen, if this, then that, those types of things. But it does, like we're saying, it doesn't have to be that way. Another thing to consider as well is contract modification verbally. So when we put contracts together, we tend to put in there that things can't be modified by the parties. The terms can't be modified unless in writing and signed by both parties. But if you don't have that in your contract and you start having some other type of conversation modifying the terms, well, then that could modify the terms of the agreement. And if you've got something on the back of a cocktail napkin and it doesn't have that language, and you guys both signed off, then you could be accidentally modifying the terms just through a conversation, through text messages, through an email, through performance, through the way that you change the way that you're performing on the contract. So, the paint the house example is very simple. Most things are not that simple, and they can get complicated fast, especially from a proof perspective and trying to establish what the parties actually agreed to.
Yeah, well, and that's why I'm a big proponent of having some process around it. So, like you gave the example of, well, you put in the contract, it can't be modified unless, signed in writing. But you can do the same thing with, my example of converting someone from an at-will employee to a term employee. You put in the offer letter, you put in the handbook, nobody at this company is a term employee unless the CEO, agrees to that, to those terms in writing. So there's a lot of things you can do just by formalizing the process to protect yourself. And when I say formalize the process, I don't mean overcomplicate it or make it heavy-handed or burdensome. Just adding a sentence in, or even into an offer letter, into a handbook, into a 2-page contract. Just making it so that some of these terms, so that you don't get overrun by the informality of it all.
Yeah. Like a lot of things we talk about on OK at Work, it's just something to be really mindful of and thoughtful in your approach, and especially when you're dealing with other people. And if it feels just informal, sometimes if you feel conversational with someone, and those things can have impact. So a lot of thinking about these things ahead of time and making sure you have a clear picture, a firm agreement in place can help save you from yourself when you're having those conversations, and make sure we've got a clear picture of what's going on. Well, thanks, Russell. Have a good day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Sarah.